virtual training that empowers you to make connection and discover and rediscover skills and explore new information. My name is Lisa Harris, and I'm part of the Learning and Development Organization. And this week we've been talking about team building. And today we're going to explore the dimensions of inclusiveness in teams. So I look forward to sharing some ideas and concepts with you. And so let's begin. So the first thing that's really important is let's talk about what does it mean to have an exclusive team? And there isn't a formal definition of this, and it means treating everyone with equivalent consideration, the same consideration that we give to ourselves, seeking people out and actively connecting with them, listening to them, accepting them, and inviting them into our lives. And this is really an important statement if you think about how we usually think about like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because what it actually says is that we need to give people consideration, to have the desire to seek people out and to really connect with them on a deeper level, and a desire to accept them as they are and invite them into relationship and partnership with them. And in many ways, this really just asks us to treat people with the same level of humanity and dignity and respect that we would expect ourselves. We must also see people as the full breadth of a person, which is not just who we see on the outside, but who they are on the inside and all the gifts and the talents that they bring. And it is often said that if you can see a person from that perspective, it is far easier to connect with them than it is if you are judging them by the perspective of some of the outer forms of the dimension that we usually use to do such. So I'm going to share with you some dimensions of diversity. And I just want you to look at this chart, and it's called Dimensions, the Impact of Equity and Inclusion. And in many cases, when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we think about the dimensions of diversity, this chart gives us kind of an organizational perspective. And so it begins with looking at things like our work status and our affiliations and our seniority. And then it moves from that level of dimension, which is organizational, and it then moves into what we call external dimensions. Excuse me. And those external dimensions cover things like your marital status, your work experience, your educational background, your personal habits and income. And then again, remember, we look at people first and foremost, where do they fit in the box for us? And then we start to gather information, and that information then leads us to the information that we see, which are these internal dimensions. And those internal dimensions are things that include the obvious things that we can see: age, ethnicity, a person's physical ability. I don't think you can always determine sexual orientation by that, but just some things that either people will see and or volunteer. I want to share another model with you that is probably closer to when we think about the organization in which we actually belong to in terms of the university. And this identity dimension was actually developed by North Central University, excuse me. And it actually walks through what they call the wheel. And with the internal dimensions, it includes something that we don't normally talk about, but is really critical when we think about inclusiveness, which is mental ability. And considering what we're going through right now with COVID, just the mental status of the people that we're working with is part of the dimension, but typically someone who might have other mental ability related concerns. It then moves into what we call community dimensions. And I love the way this actually gets phrased, because again, even the terminology is actually inclusive. And so that community dimension actually speaks to our nation of origin, what our education is, some geographic locations, our military status. And then we move into the social life experience dimension. And this is, again, as people, as we gather information and form opinions, this is where we start to look at other things that impact social structure, that we learn about people. We learn about whether in their life experiences they've had economic hardship, were they homeless at some point, what kind of maybe trauma or historical events have impacted their lives. And then that leads into what they call the institutional dimensions, which are things similar to the previous chart, where we talk about you know, what's your status in terms of full-time faculty, whether you're an international student, are you adjunct, supervisor, director. But if you see where I have the arrow pointed, the biggest thing is that it talks about part of being a team. Because no matter who we are in all of these dimensions, identity, internal, community, social experiences, and institutional, in the end, we are all a team. And so again, when you think about that definition about what it means to be inclusive, it means accepting someone in the full breadth and depth of who they are, more about who they are than the things that usually block us from actually accepting and embracing people as a team. So the next thing I want to talk about is generations, because of all of those dimensions, the one that crosses all of them is usually our age. And we can literally have conversations about the various generations and have a lot of laughs on the subject of the generations. And so I'm going to take a moment, we're going to have a little bit of fun, and I'm going to switch over to my Menti screen. And just for those who happen to be on this presentation, would love for you to just say what generation you're actually in, and we can figure out, we can figure out here, you know, who's actually on the phone, so we can enjoy your participation. So if you don't mind, the question is, what generations do you belong to? And the generations are listed actually there on the bottom, so you can see by year. And if you would take a moment and use, go to menti.com, use the code 154995, plug that in. And if you don't mind, please vote. And we will see what generation you belong to.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
The Menti screen is not the one being shared currently.
Oh.
So if you go back to the green share screen and then click on the Menti in your browser.
Is it on
there it
now?
is. Perfect.
Okay. Thank you. Got some. Okay, so talking to some fellow Gen Xers and a few millennials in the crew. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to go back. Oops. Oops, bear with me here. Sorry about this, everybody. Nothing like learning technology as you go. Okay. All right, am I now sharing this one? I want to make sure I got everybody on this one.
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, thank you. All right, so thank you for sharing. So here are the years for the generations, and that you just actually filled out. And I just want to spend a little time talking about each of those generations. And I teach a class called Building the Generations Gap. And it's the most fascinating class because what we discover is when we ask people to share some of the stereotypes about each of these generations, people have no problem just coming up with a long list and a complete blurb of all the things that they see that are not so positive about each of the generations. And what we find is that when people are sitting in those stereotypes, it becomes hard to transition when you think about it to the positives. And part of our challenge when we think about inclusiveness is if we're sitting in a space of stereotypes, then the hard thing is how do you break those stereotypes? And so normally in the class, we ask people to come up with something positive that offsets some of the negative. And it's amazing how, first and foremost, people look at what people wrote about their generations and they're like, oh, that's terrible. But we say it about all generations, and all generations have some stereotypes. And so I just wanted, for the sake of teams, I just wanted to share kind of this perspective. If you look at all of these generations, these are kind of the key values and things that they feel are important about their generation. The traditionalists value loyalty and legacy and a strong work ethic. The baby boomers value productivity and recognition and growth. Generation X values some flexibility. They value loyalty to people and not necessarily organizations. Millennials value meaningful work and teamwork. They value inclusion and they want feedback. And Generation Z, which is our newest generation, also called the iGen generation, they value family, meaningful work, inclusion, and social consciousness. And I just want you to take a moment and really look at what that list actually says. And so if we're thinking about how do you include people, and we think about people coming to the organization and being successful, the greatest opportunity we have is to look at what they all value. I think about millennials and the comments made about millennials, and one of the things is they're very dependent on their families and they're very interested and connected to their families. Well, the challenge I would have for all of us is one of our biggest families, besides our blood-related families, is a team. And so if you think about that level of loyalty, which is important to almost every generation if you look at it, then building that loyalty, which is building that culture and building that type of team, ensures that millennials or traditionalists, baby boomers, all of the generations will be more connected to their work. They'll be more committed to the goals and the outcome. You'll have less turnover, greater retention, happier employees. And so it's like literally, how do you build a team that celebrates all of these characteristics and each generation's desire to be successful and to actually contribute? And this is why when you think about that definition, you're allowing people to bring their whole self to work by valuing each of their characteristics. So bringing your whole self to work is a formal term, and it means showing up authentically, leading with humility, and remembering that we all are vulnerable and imperfect human beings. And the goal is to bring yourself to work and be comfortable about it. It means having the courage to take risks, speak up, ask for help with others in a genuine way, and allow ourselves to truly be seen, and to take this whole thing about commitment and intention and have courage so that the organization and the environment can be a place where people can actually be authentic. And so when we value people across all those dimensions and we encourage people to self-actualize, they come to work more whole, more happy, and more committed. These are just 3 questions I put out to you to consider. Are you able to show up at work as your whole self? Do you feel your team members are able to bring their whole self to work? And how do you know? Have we had the conversation with our team members, you know, in terms of even having that healthy dialogue to find out who they really are and where they're struggling? And if the answers to 1 and 2 are no, then I think this presents the greatest opportunity to sit down and have a meaningful conversation. And how do you tie that conversation back into the goals of the organization? So I want to share with you what they say will help you bring your whole self to work. Again, to show up authentic. Show up with your honest self. Don't be self-righteous, and be vulnerable. And I loved it. They had an equation here. Authenticity equation is honesty minus self-righteousness plus vulnerability will equal authenticity. Utilize the power of appreciation. This is not about recognition. This is just appreciation for taking the time to build a strong relationship, watching the negativity, finding ways to empower each other and teams. And again, it's not about recognition. It's more about the inherent value of valuing the person who does the work and who supports you. To focus on emotional intelligence. And this is, for those of you who've joined us before, this is the class that Ashley taught, right? It's important to understand that emotional intelligence is not the opposite of intelligence. It's not the triumph of heart over head. It is the unique intersection of both. And that was by David Caruso, who manages this, the Center for Emotional Intelligence at Yale. To embrace a growth mindset. Again, approaching your work and your life with the understanding that all of us can improve. It really just means, are you willing to do the hard work? Are you dedicated to do it? And are you willing to practice? And right now, in the world in which we live, embracing a growth mindset is so very critical, because we really do need to figure out how to work together as better people, how to accept the whole person, and how to embrace all those dimensions of diversity. And in the end, the issue is, how do you create a champion team? And again, it starts with where I began. How do you build the culture? And if you think about the culture of your organization right now, what are you missing and what do you need that would help you create a caring and supportive environment where people can bring their best self together to do their greatest work? I love this quote. It says, "We are not a team because we work together. We are a team because we respect, trust, and care for each other." And at the end, if your culture supports this, it doesn't matter who I am, where I come from, what my experiences are, what I can contribute. It means the environment is not only going to support all of that, but it's going to allow me to actually grow and become better and to stretch myself and to be the best person I can possibly be. And when you think about what it means to be a team, people don't want to leave teams like that, and they don't want to leave organizations, and they don't want to leave companies like that. And ultimately, UVA's goal is to retain the best and brightest and to grow the best and brightest. And so this is all of our goal as a team. And so just to wrap up, this conversation today was on inclusive teams. And we talked about valuing differences of teams and what that looks like across the dimensions of diversity, and the importance of bringing your whole self to work so that you, your team members, the organization, and the university can actually do its awesome job and do its best to achieve its goals. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Today we talked about inclusive teams. I hope you have a wonderful day. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you for joining us.